Imagine being trapped in a nightmare so horrific, so unimaginable, that it defies the very essence of humanity. A woman, stripped of her dignity, her identity, her very essence, forced to endure a fate no living being should ever experience. And yet, this was the reality for a woman known only as the Mare of Mississippi. A woman who, at the heart of an ugly chapter in American history, was forced to breed with a stallion for the grotesque purposes of experimentation. But when things went wrong, when she failed to fulfill the cruel expectations placed upon her, the blame was squarely placed on her. She was seen as the one at fault. But why? And what happened next? Today, we're diving into a story so chilling that it will make you question the very foundations of slavery and the depths of cruelty it inspired. Stay with us as we uncover the truth about the Mare of Mississippi. If this story has already shocked you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with others who need to hear it. Let's dive deep into this untold chapter of history. Mississippi, a state woven deeply into the fabric of the American South, where slavery wasn't just an institution, it was a way of life. The year is unknown, but the cruelty, the systemic injustice, and the horrors that took place here are seared into history. It was a time when the lives of black men, women, and children were reduced to nothing more than property. And in the midst of this oppressive world, some of the most unimaginable atrocities occurred. In Mississippi, just as in many other parts of the South, slavery had grown into a brutal system that commodified human beings. Enslaved individuals were forced to work the land, harvesting cotton, tobacco, and other crops under grueling conditions. But beyond the forced labor, there were darker, more sinister experiments happening behind closed doors. Some slave owners sought to push the boundaries of cruelty, believing that the bodies of enslaved black people were mere vessels for their own sick purposes. This twisted notion of control didn't stop at labor. It crossed the line into grotesque ideas about reproduction and human breeding. Slave owners believed that they could create stronger, more valuable enslaved people by manipulating the breeding of those they owned, and this horrific mindset would lead to a series of experiments that targeted the very essence of human dignity. But how far did it go? And how did these sickening practices shape the lives of the enslaved? In this chapter, we'll explore the background that made such a nightmare possible, and how it all came crashing down on one woman whose name would forever be tied to a dark chapter of history. She was a woman like any other, born into a world where her very existence was controlled by forces beyond her reach. Her name was not recorded in the history books, lost to time. But her story is as haunting as any. Known only as the Mare of Mississippi, she became a symbol of a grotesque experiment that sought to strip her of everything that made her human. Before the horrors began, this woman had a life, a family perhaps, dreams and desires. She may have lived in a cabin, surrounded by the thick Mississippi heat, the air thick with the scent of cotton, and the oppressive weight of oppression. But her life was about to take a horrific turn, one that would strip her of her humanity and reduce her to a mere object of experimentation. This wasn't a one-off tragedy. It was a manifestation of a larger, deeply ingrained system of control. Enslaved women, especially those with perceived valuable physical traits, were often seen as little more than tools to increase the slave owner's wealth. For some, the ability to breed stronger or more obedient slaves became a twisted form of currency. But what was it like for her, this unnamed woman, to be reduced to such an extent? Imagine being seen not as a person, but as a breeding animal, your worth determined by the ability to carry and bear children, children who would be owned by the same system that enslaved you. What went through her mind in those moments of horror? We can never fully know, but we can imagine the unspeakable pain she must have felt. Her story is a tragic reminder of the lengths to which human beings will go when they abandon empathy, and how slavery twisted the very nature of humanity into something unrecognizable. It's almost unimaginable, the idea that someone would intentionally subject another human being to such unspeakable cruelty. But in the twisted world of slavery, this was not just an idea. It was carried out as an experiment. The woman at the heart of this horrific story, who we will refer to as the Mare of Mississippi, became the unwilling participant in one of the darkest chapters of human exploitation. The experiment in question was rooted in a vile belief that enslaved people could be bred like animals to produce stronger offspring, people who could be sold for more, work harder, and, in the twisted logic of slaveholders, were more valuable. It's a concept that seems alien to us now, but in the 19th century South, such dehumanizing notions were tragically not uncommon. The woman was chosen, not for her worth, her personality, or her value as a human being, but because of the perceived physical traits that could supposedly produce stronger offspring. It was a calculated decision made by people who viewed her, and others like her, as property. The horror of it doesn't stop there. She was forced to mate with a stallion, a creature that, in their eyes, could potentially improve her physical capabilities, ensuring the success of this grotesque breeding experiment. The cruelty of it defies words. The woman was subjected to the unbearable indignity of being used as a mere tool in a depraved system. She was not seen as an individual, not as a human, but as a means to an end. And yet, in the face of this horror, her story remains shrouded in mystery. We can only imagine the pain, the humiliation, and the helplessness she must have felt, trapped in a world that saw her as nothing more than livestock. What happens when a cruel experiment fails? In the case of the Mare of Mississippi, the failure was as tragic as the experiment itself. The plan, to use a human being as a mere vessel to breed stronger slaves, did not go as intended. But when things didn't work, the blame was immediately cast upon her. She, the victim, was held responsible for the failure of a process she had no control over, no power in, and certainly no consent to. The logic behind the experiment was rooted in a cruel and twisted belief that enslaved women could be used to produce stronger, more marketable human beings. When that did not happen, when the result of the forced union didn't meet the sick expectations of her captors, she was seen as the one at fault. How could a system so entrenched in dehumanization place the blame on the very person who had been violated beyond comprehension? Her humiliation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. She was forced to bear the weight of this failure, made to feel as though her body, which had already been violated, was somehow at fault for the failure of this experiment. In reality, the entire system was a grotesque mockery of human dignity. Yet, In the eyes of those who controlled her, she became the scapegoat. The failure of this experiment wasn't just about the physical results. It was a moral and psychological failure that echoes through history. In blaming her for something that was beyond her control, they exposed the sheer cruelty of the system. Not only had she been reduced to an object, but she was now being punished for a failed experiment that had never been her responsibility to begin with. At the heart of this grotesque experiment lay one of the most insidious forces of all: power. The power to control, to dehumanize, and to strip away the very essence of a person's humanity. In the context of slavery, power wasn't just about owning land or wealth. It was about owning lives, about dominating every aspect of existence, and it manifested in the cruelest of ways. Slavery wasn't just a labor system. It was a structure built on total control over another human being. The enslaved were not allowed to make decisions for themselves, not even when it came to their own bodies. This woman, forced into the breeding experiment, was a symbol of that control. Her life, her body, and her worth were determined entirely by the whims of those who held the power. She had no autonomy, no voice, and no choice in what happened to her. Her suffering was an extension of the larger system, one that perpetuated violence, humiliation, and degradation for generations. In this context, the power dynamic wasn't just one of physical ownership, it was psychological as well. The enslaved were broken down mentally, taught to believe they were lesser beings, that their worth was tied to their labor, or, in the case of women like the Mare of Mississippi, their ability to reproduce. This psychological manipulation was as deadly as the physical violence they endured. It ensured that even when they were freed, the scars of this power struggle lingered for life. The forced breeding experiment was just one of the many ways power was wielded to control, manipulate, and reduce human beings to mere tools. It wasn't just about making money. It was about reinforcing a structure that relied on total dominance and the denial of basic human rights. In a world where power ruled everything, the enslaved were seen as nothing more than pawns in a game they never agreed to play. The brutal experiment that the Mare of Mississippi was subjected to was not just about power. It was rooted in something even more insidious: the myth of racial superiority. This was a belief that black people were inherently inferior and that their value lay solely in their ability to serve white people. It was an ideology so deeply ingrained in the fabric of society that it justified every form of cruelty, no matter how unimaginable. The so-called breeding experiments, like the one forced upon this woman, were based on the perverse idea that black people were less human than their white counterparts. The underlying belief was that they were a different species, something to be controlled, manipulated, and even bred for profit. It wasn't just about dehumanization. It was an attempt to cement the racial hierarchy that justified slavery itself. This ideology of racial superiority wasn't just confined to the wealthy plantation owners who orchestrated such horrors. It spread throughout society, reinforced by laws, religion, and culture. It seeped into every corner of American life, creating an environment where enslaved people were treated as little more than livestock. Their bodies, their labor, and even their ability to reproduce were exploited to further the economic interests of their oppressors. But it wasn't just about labor. It was about creating a racialized system of control that placed white people at the top and black people at the bottom. And within that system, black women were doubly oppressed. Not only were they denied the most basic human rights, but they were also seen as nothing more than vessels for reproduction, tools to perpetuate the system of slavery. The myth of racial superiority created the justification for these unspeakable acts, and its poisonous grip on American society lasted for generations, leaving scars that still linger today. To truly understand the horror of what happened to the Mare of Mississippi, we must step back and examine the broader context of slavery in the South. Mississippi, like other southern states, was a hotbed of brutality, where human lives were treated as nothing more than commodities. But what drove this cruelty? How did this oppressive system become so entrenched that it not only survived, but thrived for centuries? Slavery wasn't just about picking cotton. It was a complex, deeply ingrained institution that permeated nearly every aspect of life in the South. By the time this experiment was carried out, slavery had been institutionalized for over 200 years. Enslaved people were the backbone of Southern economy, powering industries that made up a significant portion of the country's wealth. Cotton, tobacco, and sugar were the primary exports, and the labor of enslaved individuals was the foundation of this empire. But this system was not just about economics. It was about control, about maintaining a rigid social structure where white supremacy was paramount. And when the economy relied so heavily on enslaved labor, any challenge to the system was seen as a threat, not just to wealth, but to the very foundation of Southern society. This led to extreme measures to ensure that slavery remained in place, including the dehumanization of those forced into bondage. They were reduced to tools, objects to be used at the will of their masters. The Mare of Mississippi was not an isolated case. She was just one example of a broader pattern of abuse and exploitation, one that extended to every corner of Southern life. The cruelty of forced breeding, the stripping away of personal identity, and the refusal to recognize enslaved people as human beings were all part of a much larger system of racial control that affected millions of lives. As the years went by, the horrors of slavery began to be exposed, but the story of the Mare of Mississippi remained buried for a long time. Why is it that some stories, no matter how horrific, are hidden away from the public eye? Is it the discomfort of confronting such deep historical cruelty? Or is it that we, as a society, often shy away from the uncomfortable truths that force us to face our own complicity in perpetuating injustice? For decades, the truth about the forced breeding experiments and the extreme cruelty inflicted upon enslaved people was kept under wraps. The records were often vague, the perpetrators long gone, and the victims silenced, literally and figuratively. These dark chapters were swept under the rug, largely because they challenged the sanitized version of history that many wanted to preserve. But even though the official records were often incomplete, the echoes of these horrors lingered in the stories passed down through generations. What allowed this story to remain untold for so long? The answer lies in the systemic effort to erase the truth. It wasn't just about hiding the physical atrocities. It was about erasing the very human cost of slavery, If the public had known, if the truth had been widely acknowledged, what would it have meant for the systems that were built on such suffering? Over the years, however, historians, descendants, and activists have worked tirelessly to uncover these hidden truths. Through research, oral histories, and the recovery of lost records, the truth about the forced breeding experiments and other cruel practices of slavery has slowly come to light. And with it, we've been forced to reckon with the legacy of racism, exploitation, and trauma that continues to haunt America today. The story of the Mare of Mississippi is more than just an isolated tragedy. It's a reflection of the enduring legacy of slavery and its long-lasting impacts on the lives of those who endured it and on the society that allowed it to thrive. This woman's suffering, though a dark chapter in American history, serves as a powerful symbol of how slavery dehumanized millions, reducing them to mere property, their lives determined by the whims of their captors. But what is the legacy of such a horrific past? Can we ever truly understand the depth of the damage done? The emotional scars left by such brutality are not easily healed. The trauma experienced by those enslaved and the generations that followed is something that continues to echo through history. It's a legacy marked by systemic racism, economic inequality, and social injustice, issues that continue to affect Black communities in America today. When we look at the legacy of slavery, we can see its fingerprints everywhere. On the economic systems that were built on the backs of enslaved labor, on the social structures that perpetuated racial hierarchies, and on the continued discrimination that affects Black people across the nation. The forced breeding experiments like the one endured by the Mare of Mississippi were a sickening extension of this system, yet they serve as a stark reminder of how deeply embedded these racist ideologies were. As we acknowledge this legacy, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how slavery shaped the modern world. It is a painful process, but it's one that we must engage in if we are to begin the work of healing. By understanding the suffering of the past, we take the first step toward dismantling the systems that continue to perpetuate inequality today. As we reflect on the unimaginable horrors that the Mare of Mississippi and countless other enslaved individuals endured, we must ask ourselves, what does justice look like for the victims of such systemic cruelty? Can there ever be a true reckoning for the lives that were stolen, the humanity that was erased, and the dignity that was so violently stripped away? The answer is complex, but it begins with acknowledging the full truth of this dark history. The horrors of slavery cannot simply be relegated to the past. They continue to have a profound impact on the present day. Generations of Black Americans have borne the weight of these historical injustices. Through the ongoing effects of racism, economic disparity, and social inequality. And though many of the perpetrators of these atrocities are long gone, the systems they created still exist, shaping lives in ways that are often invisible, but deeply felt. True justice doesn't come from just learning about these atrocities. It comes from taking action. It comes from recognizing that the fight for equality and reparations is not just a matter of acknowledging what happened. It's about changing the systems that continue to perpetuate harm. It's about dismantling the racial hierarchies that were built on the back of slavery and ensuring that every person, regardless of their skin color, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. This is the challenge before us. The story of the Mare of Mississippi is a painful reminder of the past, but it is also a call to action. It's a call to confront the legacy of slavery, to fight against the inequalities that continue to affect Black communities, and to honor the memory of those who suffered by working toward a more just and equitable future.